Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. I don't like to repeat myself, or rather, I know that it's annoying for a lot of you when I do. So generally I try to avoid it, but I have to remember that every episode could be somebody's first episode. Beyond that, today we're going to look at some of the first really notable moves of the golden age of piracy. With that in mind, I'd like to ask one last time with feeling, what is the golden age of piracy? The phrase probably originated in Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates. And there's a very real possibility that, when writing that phrase, Captain Johnson was joking, being facetious, tongue-in-cheek. I'm trying to say he was being a smartass. A golden age, as people at the time would have understood it, almost certainly referred to the height of the Roman Empire, when culture and power and art and literature and military might, territorial expansion, all of the metrics of civilization were at their greatest extent. A few hundred dirty, drunken, anarchist, nomadic sea robbers hardly equate to that. But even so, even if he were joking, the golden age of piracy has become kind of a shorthand for a period of time in the early modern era in which pirates represented a threat to the stability of European trade and profits and expansion. But exactly what period of time the golden age of piracy represents is something of a lingering question. The broadest possible definition includes the whole of the Age of Sail, from Francis Drake all the way to the Napoleonic era. Slightly more conservative definitions will begin with Henry Morgan and the Brethren of the Coast, and take that to about the 1720s. The most restrictive definitions would focus almost exclusively on the Pirate Republic at Nassau. However, most historians and writers choose the definition that we're going to use here today, that the golden age of piracy begins in the early 1690s, in the wake of the crackdown on piracy in the 1680s, at the outset of the 9 Years' War, when, shockingly, large numbers of old pirates and navy men and privateers and independent merchant marines, when they abandoned their jobs and bases and their hunting grounds to sail away, to sail east into the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. Today, we're going to begin our look at today, in a very real way, marks the beginning of our look at that definition of the golden age of piracy. This is episode 188, Reunion. For the past several episodes, we've focused pretty exclusively on Massachusetts. I hope that I've imparted what an unpleasant and strict place to live that could be. But today we're going to turn our eyes south. Not to the West Indies and not to Madagascar, at least not yet. Instead, we're going to begin in the sunny climes and sandy beaches of colonial New York. Here in about 1690, the New York colony was still smaller than Massachusetts. The colony, the whole of New York colony, was home to only 5,000 colonists, while Boston alone held 7,000. Colonist might not be the proper term there, actually. I should say that instead New York was home to 5,000 non-native inhabitants. There were a huge number of slaves in New York at the time. Really, that's what New York had going for it. Boston and Providence and Philadelphia had better amenities and more money and really a much more active trading market. But the Puritans in New England and the Quakers in Pennsylvania had this annoying habit of abolitionism. New York, on the other hand, or really New Amsterdam, was the home to the first slave auction in America. And the trade in human beings had only grown in the years since that. It was slavery, the economic backbone of the city, but the trade was limited to Englishmen. The Royal Africa Company controlled all slave trade in the English-speaking world and regulated the whole affair in America. The problem, though, is that New York was a multicultural melting pot, even back then. It was home to a huge number of Swiss and Dutch and German and Jewish and French immigrants and exiles from all over the world. Now, most of these immigrants and exiles were regular working people, laborers and weavers and fishermen and washerwomen and tavern owners, artisans, that kind of thing. But there were a few who had managed to amass sizable fortunes in the New World. Now they were cut out of the slave trade, the most lucrative trade in New York. They had to turn to other avenues to invest and increase their fortunes. Those other avenues were, well, it's kind of funny. Here in the modern world, we see slavery as the evil that it was, and many of us see piracy as kind of a Disneyfied, sanitized children's ride. But in 1690 or so, the slave trade was a perfectly moral and legal occupation, while piracy was detestable. And that is the avenue that many of these investors took. Listen to what one East India Company official said of the pirate economy in New York. He wrote in 1694, quote, "It is certain that these villains frequently carry their unjust gains to New York, where they are permitted egress and regress without control, spending such coin there in the usual lavish manner of such persons." End quote. When that East India Company official said egress and regress, he's talking about coming and going. He's saying that pirates in New York had freedom of movement that they had almost nowhere else in the English world. By 1688, piracy was something of a cottage industry in New York, but it was about to explode in size and in market share, thanks in large part to two men, Frederick Phillips and Adam Baldridge. Now, we last visited New York in 1688 in the wake of the revolution against Edmund Andros. You'll recall Jacob Leisler, that middle-class German merchant who had declared himself governor. But that really hardly mattered after a few months' time. He was living in Albany in exile, leading little more than a small militia. The man who was really in charge in New York, or at least one of them, was Friedrich Philipson, a Dutch merchant who had anglicized his name to Frederick Phillips. The revolving door of governors who were nominally in charge of New York were essentially appointed by Frederick Phillips and his council of wealthy merchant friends. Now, we don't know how Frederick Phillips got involved with Adam Baldridge, but it was probably the slave trade. Adam Baldridge was a smuggler and a small-time pirate. Not an out-and-out scallywag, but not exactly the kind of guy that a luminary like Frederick Phillips would telegraph his relationship with. But Baldridge did have contacts down in Port Royal, as well as Charleston and Nassau and in Africa. Baldridge was what the Royal Africa Company considered an interloper. He traded slaves illegally, without royal license. And although nobody at the time knew it, or at least nobody at the time would admit to knowing it, Frederick Phillips was one of his primary customers. All that land he bought, all those churches he built, much of it was on the dime of the illegal slave trade. The problem is, though, Adam Baldridge was trying to get out of the slave trade. The arrival of Bachelor's Delight in 1688 may have had something to do with it, but I think even more was the warrant for his arrest in Port Royal, Jamaica. Not for piracy, but for murder. He'd killed somebody down there and was unlikely to return. But probably the primary reason he wanted to get out of the slave trade was the Royal Africa Company. They were not people that messed around. If you infringed on their business, they might have you arrested. But only if you were a rich and powerful pillar of the community like Frederick Phillips. For a man like Adam Baldridge, they'd just have you killed. The Royal Africa Company did have assassins on the payroll. They were trained to infiltrate and poison or strangle a target, but that wasn't for a person like Baldridge. A man like Baldridge would just be gunned down in his home or maybe in the tavern he's staying at. I mean, it's not like anybody's going to stop the Royal Africa Company, and killing a man so publicly would certainly send a message. There was a host of reasons that Adam Baldridge may have wanted to get out of the slave trade, but something really dramatic seems to have changed in 1688 or 1689. We can't say for certain what it was. It involved pirates, certainly, and shady business deals and powerful men like Phillips, so it's not like Baldridge was going to write any of it down. But that question, exactly what changed there in 1688 or 89, well, that's what we're going to explore today. What we know for certain is that in 1691, Adam Baldridge sailed out of New York to establish a base on the Indian Ocean, a base that would be used mostly by pirates and smugglers. It's the circumstances surrounding that decision, though, that are so interesting. If Adam Baldridge was done defying the Royal Africa Company, why would he antagonize the East India Company? Well, there's a few things to remember here. In 1688, the East India Company was powerful and large, but they weren't what we picture when we think about the East India Company. You know, a huge, private, militarily dominant corporation that, well, all of that comes from later on, when the East India Company was in charge of India. Don't picture a plucky little startup, but there was room to maneuver without infringing on East India Company business. See, they were still busy competing with the Dutch and the French and the Portuguese in the Southern Asian world. And the locals, too, who are a big part of this story. Asia was controlled by, at least the parts that weren't colonized, were controlled by a number of dynastic empires. There were those empires that were known at the time as Burma and Siam. We know them today as Myanmar and Thailand. There was the Nguyen Empire in much of modern-day Cambodia and Laos and in most of Vietnam. And they were all important geopolitical players, but then we have the really heavy hitters. The Qing dynasty in China should never be ignored, nor should the Mughal Empire in modern-day India. We should really call them the Mughal Sultanate, as it was a huge Islamic state, a Sunni state, that stretched from the border of Shia Persia all the way to Pakistan and Afghanistan, and in the whole of the Indian subcontinent. It was a massive political body. Not only was it massive, it was rich, which will concern us in the weeks to come, and it was powerful. So powerful, in fact, that it stood in the way of English expansion. There's this popular myth that the British accidentally founded their empire in Asia. It's a myth that you'll see propagated mostly by the imperialist British. We shouldn't believe it. It's a lie. You don't accidentally found an empire. The Romans would tell the same lie. They're just protecting their borders here, but you can't muster and outfit and supply huge armies and navies and march them all across the globe accidentally. It's like your fiancé telling you that they accidentally slept with your best friend. It's not an accident. The point is, though, the English were trying to expand their influence in the region while, at the same time, Adam Baldridge was looking to get out of the slavery game, to expand his business into new markets. For a man in his line of work, the Indian Ocean is a perfect place to set up shop. Now, we do know that while Baldridge was still in America, he spent a ton of money outfitting his journey. It could have all been his own capital, but it's a lot more likely that he enjoyed investments from men like Frederick Phillips. He bought a huge amount of food and rum and wine and comforts, like luxury goods, the kinds of things that men from the quote-unquote civilized world would have trouble finding out on the Indian Ocean. And then he bought guns. Really, it was mostly guns. He bought pistols and muskets and swivel guns and shot and powder and cannon, all kinds of stuff. And actually, this is a decent place to pause and note a thing or two about pirate weaponry. There's a a sea change taking place here at the outset of the 9 Years' War. There's an ocean of difference between the armament of the buccaneers and this next generation of pirates. A tidal wave of... No, I'll stop. The point is, the flintlock musket was a big deal, especially at sea, where the flintlock firing mechanism would be better protected from water. The flintlock design had been around for a while now, but by this point it had finally become omnipresent enough to really filter down to the likes of lowly pirates. It also allowed for a greater production of pistols. You're a lot less likely to burn your hand with a flintlock firing mechanism than the older matchlock designs, so you can have a smaller gun. You don't need a long gun to fire. With flintlock pistols at their disposal, pirates could begin to carry the 2 or 3 or sometimes even 4 pistols in their belts that they became so famous for, compared to the single-use muskets common among the buccaneers. That's a huge improvement in firepower, and of course they still had muskets with them. And if, for the sake of argument, they happened to have a sweet bandolier crisscrossing their chest a la Blackbeard, you could carry 8 or 10. And then there are the swords. I don't want to nerd out too hard here, but it is interesting. So a saber refers to virtually any curved sword, right? Sabers were preferred by cavalrymen as well as almost every navy in the world. The cutlass was a type of saber, and the Anglo-American cutlass is a short and relatively thin, slightly curved naval sword. The design of the cutlass didn't much change between, say, the Elizabethan Age and the American Civil War. But that thin, slightly curved blade isn't the image of a pirate sword, right? At least not a Halloween costume pirate sword. That blade, the pirate sword, is shorter and a lot more broad than a traditional cutlass. But because it's so broad, you get that curved, tapered end, kind of like a Bowie knife. That's how you get a sharp point on such a wide blade. I mean, you know what I'm talking about here. It's a Halloween costume pirate sword, but believe it or not, that's a real sword design. It was a mainstay of Barbary pirates. That broad, curved blade was a variation of the Muslim world's scimitar, built for naval use. The curved edge and tapered point made it ideal for slicing and piercing attacks. The broadness of the blade allowed it to be used as a sort of machete. You could cut through ropes on your ship or the brush in the jungle with it. In fact, in much of the Caribbean world today, a cutlass is their name for what we call a machete. When Adam Baldridge went on his shopping spree, he did buy quite a few English cutlasses. But the pirates with whom he was about to become so well acquainted decided, in large part, that they preferred the designs out of the Ottoman and Mughal empires. And this whole story, the story of the pirates of the Round, the Red Sea Men, really it's little more than a chapter in a centuries-long drama between the imperial powers of Europe and their colonial quest for control of the sea routes to Asia. That means control of at least enough territory for your naval bases. You need stopping points on the long and arduous trek from Europe all the way around the Cape of Good Hope and finally across the Indian Ocean to Asia. You needed to stop for wood and water and food, and you needed friendly ports in which to do so. For the English, the southern Atlantic wasn't a problem. They had a number of good stopping points. But rounding the Cape was a problem for the English. South Africa was controlled by the Dutch. That's why you have cities there today named Bloemfontein and Johannesburg. There was also the Fort de Good Hope, which would become Cape Town. This was a problem for the English, at least until the Dutch stadholder, William, became the King of England. But it was still kind of a problem. Even though the King of England was perhaps the most powerful man in the Netherlands, they were still different nations. The English in Dutch ports had to pay exorbitant fees to stop in Dutch ports. Not an ideal state of affairs, especially on a merchant voyage, a voyage intended to turn a profit. It wouldn't have been a problem if there were somewhere to stop on the eastern side of Africa. But for the English, there really wasn't. North of the Dutch-controlled southern tip of Africa, the Portuguese controlled most of the port cities on the mainland. That's Portuguese Mozambique. North of that, you'd run into the Ethiopian Empire, who was not friendly to most of the powers of old Europe, and they had the strength to repel anyone who might come knocking, and by that point you're on the borders of Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. Mainland Africa was essentially out. But that leaves Madagascar. And mainland Madagascar was as unfriendly as Ethiopia. The locals had been engaged in a decades-long war for control of the coast between a bunch of different factions on the island. But this conflict was escalated by the Ottomans and the Mughals and the Portuguese and Ethiopians and the French. All of those powers had interests in the region, and they armed and supplied different factions on Madagascar. Now, as an American, I wouldn't know anything about arming local populations to fight factional wars in their home countries in order to promote instability for our own financial and military gain, but that's what was happening here. If Madagascar could have been claimed by anyone, it would be a huge upset in global power dynamics. So all of the empires of the world gave the Madagascar locals a ton of surplus cannons and guns. Especially France. They had a ton of interest in the region. They controlled a ton of the islands surrounding Madagascar, and allowing anyone else to establish a presence there would have been dangerous. The French had ports at Mayotte to the northwest, between Madagascar and mainland Africa. At Mauritius, an island group to the southwest, they had a number of port cities. And of course their biggest in the region was at Île de Réunion, Reunion Island. Any of you who are familiar with this story, or really the story of piracy in general, will likely know the island of Reunion for its famous gallows. A gallows where many a pirate, some of them quite famous, met their end. Reunion Island is important. But then, of course, the French had one last outpost in the region, a tiny little port at the Île Sainte-Marie, an island just off the northeast coast of Madagascar. It was close to mainland Madagascar, close enough to see it, maybe close enough for a strong swimmer to swim, but I wouldn't recommend it. Île Sainte-Marie had a fantastic natural port, and it would have been a location that any imperial power would have desired to establish themselves, but because it was so close to Madagascar, they suffered attacks from the locals. By 1690, the French had all but abandoned Île Sainte-Marie in favor of Reunion. That's why Adam Baldridge was able to establish an outpost there. Now again, we don't know much about how that actually happened. The most extensive account we do have comes from Captain Johnson's General History of the Pirates, and almost certainly from a second edition and a different author, but it's a fictional account of the pirates' arrival in the Indian Ocean, the story of Captain Misson. That story likely has some validity hidden behind the fictions it presents. In the weeks to come, we'll likely return to the story of Captain James Misson from time to time. But we do have Adam Baldridge's own account of his arrival. He said, quote, July the 17th, 1690. I, Adam Baldridge, arrived at the island of St. Mary's in the ship Fortune, Richard Conyers commander. I left the ship, being minded to settle among the Negroes at St. Mary's with 2 men more, but the ship was cast away. End quote. According to Adam Baldridge, that ship, in being cast away, lost half her crew, and the rest disappeared into Asia. Now, far be it from me to question the word of such a reputable man as Adam Baldridge, especially since, at the time, he was under oath to God and the king. He was on trial when he said those words. But I can't find any record of a Captain Richard Conyers on the ship Fortune in the 1680s. Except, of course, for this testimony. Now, that's not to say that he wasn't a real person. I could have just failed to find it, or this might be the only written record of a Captain Richard Conyers. But if I were on trial for aiding and abetting a host of notorious and, by that point, world-famous pirates, I might just lie a little bit about who dropped me off there, and about my intentions on St. Mary's. Adam Baldridge would have us believe that he was there in a, well, yes, self-interested, but also a patriotic attempt to claim a little piece of land for England. If he were to establish a port city there on St. Mary's, he would be able to earn himself a pretty penny, but he would also be able to aid the English in the war. And to be fair to Adam Baldridge, he did that. His port at St. Mary's would welcome a number of battered and bedraggled English ships after their trip around the Cape or on their way back. Some of them, many of them even, were honest and legitimate merchant ships and a couple of navy vessels. But mostly, the vast majority of them, were pirates. And that's what it was intended to be. See, between the time when Bachelor's Delight and George Rayner arrived in America back in 1688, and when Adam Baldridge arrived at St. Mary's in 1690, there was a fortuitous meeting there at Madagascar. This is the big question, the event that might give us a reason why Adam Baldridge chose to sail for St. Mary's. In 1689, Bachelor's Delight sailed away from America for Africa, to arrive, finally, at Madagascar. Now, I'm not sure why they undertook that voyage. They captured no prizes of any note, nothing at least has come down to us, and then, after arriving at Madagascar, they turned around and sailed back to New York. It's almost as if they were paid to scout out Madagascar by, I don't know, a corrupt merchant there in New York with perhaps powerful connections at the highest echelons of society. When Bachelor's Delight arrived at Madagascar, they landed in St. Augustine Bay. That's at the southwestern corner of Madagascar. In fact, it's where Captain Johnson tells us that Captain Masson made landfall to establish Libertalia. I'm not ready to open the can of worms that is Libertalia. We touched on this when we talked about James Masson, but for those of you who may not be aware, Libertalia was, according to legend, an independent pirate nation. Exactly what kind of nation, we're not sure. A pirate kingdom? A pirate republic, maybe? Of course, what those ideals were tend to differ, depending on who's telling you about Libertalia. Everything from a privateer base loyal to the English crown to an outright anarchist pirate commune, and everything in between. But we need to remember that Libertalia did not exist. But it also kind of did. I mean, that's really what we're talking about here. The idea of Libertalia, even if it was never given that name by the men and women who populated it, was real. And it's an idea that we're going to examine in the weeks to come. But as far as the real story is concerned, Bachelor's Delight, there in St. Augustine's Bay, met with none other than the pirate ship Signet, under Captain John Reed. Now I know I might have mentioned this before in passing, but if you could all just pretend to be super shocked by this big reveal, I'd really appreciate it. Ever since William Dampier left the Signet back in 1686, they'd been roving all around the Indian and Pacific Oceans looking for plunder and adventure. Mostly they'd found more adventure than plunder. Signet captured enough prizes and enough booty to keep themselves fed, but not much else. Alcohol was in scant supply in Muslim ports, which meant they had a tough time keeping water on hand. Their purses and sea chests were mostly empty, and they stayed that way. And the Signet, the ship herself, was in really bad shape. Her hull was worm-eaten, she was storm-battered, her masts were cracking, really she was just falling apart. They had few friendly ports there in Asia, and they might not have careened her even once since Charles Swan had been in command. But when Signet met with Bachelor's Delight in St. Augustine Bay, they had just scored a huge win. Several weeks earlier, off the coast of Myanmar, they had captured a large Portuguese merchantman, a ship that was filled with all of the spices and riches that the Orient had to offer. Pepper and cloves and mace and nutmeg and indigo, all of it, bound for Portugal, found its way into the holds of the pirate ship Signet. And as soon as they finished loading their ship up, Signet ran. Everyone in the region was after them. The Portuguese, the Indians, anybody who wanted to either bring the pirates to justice or capture those spices for themselves, chased their less than pristine pirate ship. They ran at first into the Red Sea. Now the Red Sea was controlled on both sides by the Ottoman Empire, which wasn't without its own share of dangers, but at least that means that nobody else was going to be stupid enough to follow them up there. The Red Sea, by the way, is that body of water that separates Arabia from Africa, and it's always been a hotbed of piracy. Back when Moses parted the Red Sea, there's a reasonable chance he may have displaced a pirate. And today, of course, the Red Sea and its nearby waters in the larger ocean is home to many a Somali pirate. The Red Sea, like St. Mary's and Reunion Island, is a location we're going to need to remember. But for now, almost as soon as the pirates entered the Red Sea, they were pushed back out. They were in unfamiliar waters, but that's not really the point here. The point is that the very next place they were able to stop, in their ship filled with extraordinarily valuable cargo, a ship that was currently sinking, was the Bay of St. Augustine, where, of course, they ran into Bachelor's Delight. Now, this meeting was not planned. The pirates, back in 1684, after taking a beating off the Peruvian coast, they didn't plan to meet up 6 years later off the coast of Africa. This meeting was happenstance, but it was lucky. The records of what happened here are at the very best spotty, but we do know that some of Signet's crew climbed aboard Bachelor's Delight to head back to New York with George Rayner, and we can assume that they carried all of their shares of that mighty Portuguese haul with them. I mean, would you leave all of your worldly wealth in the hands of a pirate, even if you yourself were a pirate? I certainly hope not. Now, what happened to the rest of the crew of the Signet is difficult to say, including John Reed. Some of them did stay there at Madagascar and would join up with Adam Baldridge later on. That would create the core of the myth of Libertalia. Some of those pirates married local women. Of course, some of the pirates got killed in fights with local men, often over their new wives. But a good number of the Signet pirates stole a ship that happened into the Bay of St. Augustine and made their way to the Ottoman Empire. That might not have been a bad move. You know, if you're a wanted man in whatever country you happen to come from, and you have the spices to buy your way to safety in the Ottoman world, they would be willing to give you a job as a privateer or Barbary pirate. But back in New York, Frederick Phillips somehow came into a windfall of some of the most valuable cargo on the planet. Pepper and cloves and mace and nutmeg and indigo. Now, nobody there in New York was asking too many questions because cheap nutmeg. But it was at this point, when Frederick Phillips came into this miraculous windfall, that Adam Baldridge went on a shopping spree and prepared to depart for Madagascar. Now, I won't say for certain that the pirate colony at St. Mary's Island was funded by the haul taken by the Signet, but the coincidence is there. Beyond that, many of the pirates who returned to New York with Bachelor's Delight would have known that there was a wealth of spices waiting for whoever might come to pick it up there in St. Augustine Bay. And the pirates who were still in possession of those spices at Madagascar would be fairly familiar with the waters surrounding the island, enough that, should other pirates enter the region, they could serve as navigators or guides. But look, I don't want to make it sound like Adam Baldridge is some kind of trailblazer here. He didn't come up with the idea of fencing pirate goods. It's an ancient tradition. On Jamaica, fortunes were made in that industry. But in Port Royal, there was this veneer of privateering. You could get away with it and continue to be a legitimate businessman. The Pirates of the Round had none of that. While Adam Baldridge is not the first to have taken up this line of work, he may be the most famous pirate fence of the whole of the Golden Age. I would maybe say that he was the most famous pirate fence ever, but I would point to a couple of other candidates. The Duke of Albemarle, for example, who would launder millions of pounds in buccaneer winnings at Jamaica. But of course he's not famous for having done so. Even more, though, there's Qing Shi in China, much later on in this story. It would be unfair and inaccurate to diminish everything she did by calling her merely a pirate fence, but that was a part of it. Still, Adam Baldridge is almost certainly the most famous pirate fence who got famous for fencing pirated goods. And on the 17th of July, 1690, he began to set up his little operation there on St. Mary's. Now, it's not much to talk about at first, but he was laying the groundwork for everything that is to come, for all of the Pirates of the Round. And thus, at least in the definition we're choosing to use today, Adam Baldridge was laying the groundwork for the Golden Age of piracy. Next time, we're going to look at the second name to lay the groundwork for the Golden Age of piracy. A pirate who at this point was merely a crewman on a privateer vessel. But next week, we're going to introduce him, as the world knew him, as Captain Kidd. I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I'd like to thank everybody who has helped to support the show. Everyone who has signed up to become a patron on Patreon, everybody who has left us ratings or reviews, and everybody who has recommended this show. You all make it possible. Thank you. Our theme music was, as always, The Old Captain by the fantastic band Brillig. If you haven't checked them out yet, you absolutely should do so. You can find them at brillig.com.au. That's BRILLIG.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com. As always, and most importantly, thank you for listening. To begin today, I need to get something out of the way, right off the bat. I like westerns. The movies, old westerns. Less the classic John Wayne white hat, black hat westerns. In fact, I might actually kind of hate those movies, but everything from the 70s spaghetti westerns on I really enjoy. They're filled with criminals and injustice and anti-heroes and shades of gray. Many of the same things that drew me to pirates are there in the westerns. My first cowboy movie was Young Guns 2, starring Emilio Estevez as perhaps the most famous outlaw in the Old West, Billy the Kid. And if I don't just acknowledge right here at the outset that Billy the Kid, alias William Bonney, was a Scottish-American outlaw with a name that was notably similar to our subject today, if I don't get that out of the way, I'm just going to fill the episode with terrible out-of-place jokes, or maybe even do something like construct an entire episode around the career of Billy the Kid. You don't want that. I don't want that. None of us want me to pepper in songs from the very first album I ever bought with my own money, the Young Guns 2 soundtrack by John Bon Jovi. That would be ridiculous, after all. But if we pretend, and we would be pretending, if we pretend that I spent an entire afternoon watching the Young Guns saga and reading up on Billy the Kid in an attempt to find the similarities with to structure this episode, we would be forced to recognize in that entirely hypothetical case that there just isn't that much similarity there between Billy the Kid and William Kidd. Billy the Kid, William Bonney, was, according to the eminently historically accurate film Young Guns, quote, a runaway, derelict, scud-bottom vagrant, end quote. That is something that could be said for a lot of pirates, most pirates, in fact, even pirate captains. But not William Kidd. He was something different. He was a bit of an odd fish in the world of the pirates. Those oddities make him among the most interesting and complex pirates of all time, and they make him perhaps the most famous ever to have sailed. This is episode 189, A Mighty Man. More than Billy the Kid, in many ways, William Kidd reminds me of William Dampier. Both men were educated, at least a bit. William Kidd was by no means a scholar like Dampier, but he knew how to read and write. He could keep accounts, and he was versed in all of the skills required to sail. Both men were landowners and married, although for Kidd we haven't reached that point yet. But they were gentlemen, not members of the gentry or anything so august, but solidly middle class. But it's about there that the comparisons begin to end. William Kidd was more boisterous. He was more bold. He was a better sailor and a better leader than Dampier, hence why he became a captain. Dampier, on the other hand, was a lot smarter than William Kidd. Not only as a scholar and a sage, but Dampier could almost always read the situation. He saw the perils on his path and usually managed to avoid them. William Kidd, on the other hand, rarely did. Beyond that, there are their love lives and sexuality. William Dampier was probably gay. William Kidd was not. In addition to his wife and their loving relationship, which we will get to, Kidd was known to hire or to otherwise entice scores of working women to his decks, usually for the entertainment of his crew. Whether they were New York women from Petticoat Lane or indigenous women in some faraway country, throughout his career, Kidd shelled out a fair bit of his own treasure for their services. He was known to partake himself, but mostly it was a management style. When the crew starts grumbling and turning a bit mutinous, a fair bit of wine and women brought aboard will quiet them down, at least for a while. But in the end, William Kidd just wasn't a runaway, derelict, scud-bottom vagrant. He came from a relatively good family and would raise himself up to be one of the more prominent members of New York society. That's why today we're not catching up with him on a pirate ship, but instead a legal, licensed privateer. In 1688 and early 1689, William Kidd and Robert Culliford and probably William Mason and 6 or 7 other British men sailed on board the Saint Rose under Captain Jean Charpin. The quartermaster on board Saint Rose was Jean Fantin. Now that's an odd move, signing up with the French in 1688 as a Briton. No one was of any illusion that England and France would not soon be at war, so why did these men do so? We could point to any number of hypotheticals. Maybe William Kidd, in the tradition of many a Scotsman, the Stuarts included, maybe Kidd held a warm place in his heart for the French, much warmer than many Scotsmen held for England. Maybe Kidd signed up with the French in a fit of patriotic anti-English fervor. But while we could ascribe all kinds of motivations to William Kidd signing up with the French, I don't think we should. Joining a privateer crew was just a sound financial decision. Assuming you survived, you were set to make a decent amount of money. Truth is, though, we don't know why William Kidd or Culliford or any of the others did it. They were hardly worth a mention in anybody's record except for a couple of mentions about the oddity of a group of Britons signing up to sail with the French. Which is a real shame, the lack of records. It means that we know very little about how William Kidd came into possession of his very first ship. We don't know much about how this anonymous sailor, this lowly privateer, how he became, officially, Captain Kidd. We do know a bit, though. Saint Rose was a member of the largest privateer fleet since Henry Morgan sailed on Panama. The governor of Saint-Domingue, Jean-Baptiste Ducasse, and Lauro de Graff led an armada of French privateers, mostly out of Tortuga and Petit Goave. Jean Charpin was part of that armada, and in early 1689 the Saint Rose captured a rich Dutch merchantman, somewhere in the Leeward Islands. Now this was an entirely legal military maneuver carried out by private naval contractors. But something happened here. It could have been something big and dramatic. Maybe the French on board Saint Rose tortured and killed a few Englishmen. Maybe they insulted St. George in the honor of all Britain. Maybe, more likely, William Kidd and his fellow Britons were stiffed out of their full share, the kind of thing that might happen because they were, after all, the enemy. But something does seem to have shifted for the British on board Saint Rose. A few days later, she put in at St. Kitts, a French possession at the time. The captain, Charpin, took a brigantine and enough men to sail her, along with all of the cargo that they possessed, and they sailed north, probably to Port Royal in Acadia. This was probably suggestive of a split among the crew, but it's not something we have any information about. However, we do know that the crew of Saint Rose voted in, as their new captain, Jean Fantin. And then they celebrated with a legendary party. Nearly all of these privateers went ashore to spend all of their recent winnings. They lavishly doled out coin for wine and women and song and gambling. It was quite the affair, a real boon to the economy of St. Kitts. But those French privateers made one big mistake. They left 20 of their number on board the Saint Rose to guard her. 11 or 12 of those men were French, but the rest were, William Kidd, Robert Culliford, probably William Mason, and the rest of the Britons. And maybe, it seems small, but maybe that's all it was. Maybe these British sailors were just annoyed that they had been denied the pleasures of a stop in port, or maybe this was just the opportunity that they had been waiting for. On the 15th of August, 1689, 10 months into the 9 Years' War, Captain General Christopher Codrington of Nevis wrote a letter in triplicate to his financial backers in London, to the Lords of Trade, and to his son at Oxford. He wrote that 8 days prior, on the 7th of August, he went down to the docks and, quote, found a French ship of 16 guns that had been surprised and captured by the English. She was formerly a privateer manned by 130 English and French, but mostly French. All but 20 of them made a descent on St. Christopher's, leaving the ship at anchor at Basseterre with 12 French and 8 English on board. The last named set upon the French, soon overcame them without the loss of a man, and brought the ship in here. She is now fitting for the king's service, her captain being William Kidd. End quote. Now, depending on who you listen to, among William Kidd and his contemporaries who were there, you will hear widely differing stories about why the pirates captured the Saint Rose. Everything from good old-fashioned revenge to a plan to sail her off and be proper pirates, to William Kidd's own assertion, to his tale that it was a patriotic move, another wartime maneuver to capture an enemy privateer. Maybe he'd been a sleeper agent this whole time. And usually I'm more than happy to point out the untruths that pirates were wont to tell, but in this case there is a ring of truth in all of that, in all of those. Some of those who took part in this little mutiny did have good reason for revenge. Many of them would go on to be some of the most famous pirates of the early Golden Age. And Kidd himself, well, he's a complex character. You can almost believe that he was doing this as a patriotic move. Historian Richard Zacks tells us in his book Pirate Hunter the true story of Captain Kidd, that his whole career was a tightrope walk between legitimacy and piracy. That's what makes him so fascinating. But we still don't know exactly how William Kidd became captain. And I'm aware that there's an obtrusive amount of we don't know in this episode. Most storytellers and historians choose to begin Kidd's story in 1695, which is smart. These are early days for Captain Kidd, and we don't really know a lot about them. But this story today is the reason that Captain Kidd would go on to be tapped by the governor in New York, the East India Company, a duke, even the king signed his name. The reason that those august men chose him for his later and much more famous and well-documented voyage. So it's worth talking about, even though we don't know how Captain Kidd became captain. Reports differ on the subject. He was probably voted in. That's how these things usually went at that period in time. But there are those who suggest that Christopher Codrington appointed him captain. And actually, Codrington is worth a mention here. He was a central pillar of the Leeward Islands. He had been a governor. He was a slave owner, a plantation owner, a large sugar producer. More, though, he was captain general of the whole of the Leeward Islands. That's the highest military rank held by anyone who lived there. He outranked every English governor this side of Jamaica. Whether or not he granted William Kidd his first captaincy, we'll never know, but he did grant him his first privateering commission. That commission records the name of Kidd's new ship. The Saint Rose had been rechristened to Blessed William. And I really want to give William Kidd credit for what would be an absolutely baller move, naming a ship after yourself, but that's not what happened. Blessed William was named for the king, for William III, King of England. In addition to the new name, Codrington upgraded Blessed William, gave her a full overhaul. They careened the vessel, they repaired her, they gave her new sails and 4 more big guns. Meanwhile, though, Captain Kidd recruited. And as far as I can tell, this is the earliest example in the record of pirates being recruited with a kind of a help-wanted poster. Captain Kidd nailed a copy of his ship's Articles of Agreement, his Buccaneer Code, nailed it to the door of a few local taverns. And usually there would be a note at the bottom that said something very like, inquire within. Those pirates who chose to do so would find William Kidd or Robert Culliford or maybe William Mason waiting to sign them up for this new crew. This kind of thing is going to become very common amongst pirates and privateers, but as far as I can tell, this is the first example, the earliest example, of a pirate or privateer using their code to recruit. Now, I'm not going to relate this code to you today. I can't. We don't have a copy of it. We do have a copy of the Articles of Agreement from Kidd's much more famous 1695 voyage, but those articles, as we will see when we get to it, are very specific to that voyage. However, that code must have been convincing. Captain Kidd's recruiting and Codrington's outfitting brought the complement of Blessed William to 110 men and 20 big guns, at which point she was incorporated into a small naval squadron out of Nevis, led by Admiral Thomas Houston. What follows is a decent example of what the 9 Years' War looked like in the West Indies, or at any rate in the Lesser Antilles. While there were larger land-based maneuvers taking place on Hispaniola, for example, you may recall Lauro de Graaf and the tragedy of La Limonade, there were smaller, usually clandestine, almost guerrilla naval operations happening to the east. France, Holland, and England and the Lesser Antilles were essentially paying sailors to take lessons in piracy. On 30th December, their little fleet, out of Nevis, arrived at the island of Marie Galante. one of the smaller islands in the chain that make up Guadeloupe. Marie-Galante, really all of Guadeloupe, was French territory at that time and very rich in sugar. The fleet of maybe half a dozen privateer vessels descended on the port at Grandburg and had their way with the city. There was no defense at Grandburg to speak of. A couple of coastal skimmers fired off a shot or two to defend their honor, and then they surrendered. These kinds of raids, in wartime at least, were commonplace in these islands. All those latter-day buccaneers, those who had sailed on the Pacific adventures, well, they all earned their bones in the Third Anglo-Dutch War on raids just like this. Some of them against the very same islands we're talking about today. These tiny colonies had hundreds, or in some cases thousands, of slaves. They had tons of money and sugar just lying around. But the white population of these islands, the people they would allow to hold guns, was small. They had virtually nobody to man the defenses, and in most cases had no defenses to speak of. Unless a Royal Navy squadron just happened to be in the neighborhood, they were without defense. And right now, the Royal Navy was busy. At this moment, across the Atlantic, Henry Every was serving as a gunner's mate in a fleet that was getting their asses handed to them. We'll get to that next time. But that's why the Leeward Islands, really most of the West Indies, relied on privateer fleets. They could serve as a defense force, but in order to keep that defense force around, if they weren't going to pay the privateers, they had to offer them raids like this. They were almost budgeted into the operating costs of all of these sugar islands, be they French, Dutch, or English. That's why, here at Marie-Galante, they surrendered so easily. That's how you did things. And there was a certain code of conduct expected. There was no torture or rape or murder on this raid, nor was there on many others of its kind. There were certainly rapes and killings from time to time, but if you were caught committing such acts while representing the crown, remember, they'd hang you. Your own people would hang you. Now, don't get me wrong, this wasn't a nice raid. They didn't bring tea for the locals. They'd drink up all your rum, and they'd eat all your pork, and they'd put their dirty feet up on the table, but mostly it was an orderly affair. Load up the sugar and empty the town coffers of enough silver that everyone could pretend to agree that that was all they had to offer, which of course it wasn't. Plantation owners were filthy rich, as were these colonies. But in this case, they paid off the privateers with 2,000 pounds sterling, which sounds okay, but remember that there were 6 ships here. If we assume that they were all of a similar size, that would mean 600 privateers, which, if divided equally amongst the crews, would give each man a share of 3 1/3 pounds each. Not exactly a retirement fund. Not even enough to really properly get drunk on, maybe for a night, but not for the weeks that these privateers were hoping for. Of course, their holds were full of sugar, and that's great, but a decent portion of that was going to go to old Chris Codrington. The government, after all, has to take their cut. For most of the privateers here at Marie-Galante, this was to be expected. See, a raid like this, well, this was a gig for them. They had jobs back in Nevis, usually driving slaves, but this was a little bonus. Hey, sign up for this raid and we'll go attack the French. You can drink all their rum, you can eat all their pork, maybe pinch their wives, but don't go too far. There will, however, I'm sure they were reminded, be a few exotic French demoiselles working there. Women that, and this was important, these men had never met before. Naturally, they'd have to pay, but it would probably come to no more than, say, just about what they had earned on the raid. Handy, that. But it was a good time. It was a laugh, a little vacation for these working men. But for Culliford and Mason and all of the others who had sailed under Jean Charpin, this was their job. These wages just weren't going to cut it. So they started talking. Is this really what you guys do? Okay, Sail with a real crew and you're not going to see scraps like this. We're talking about sea chests filled with silver and gold. Oh yeah, I used to have one. What happened to it? Well, I spent it after all of it on wine and women and a good time. And, the rest of it I buried. Yeah, I buried treasure all over the West Indies. I'm a rich man. But really, I'm here for the adventure. So, you want in? They did indeed want in. And that desire would only grow. Things were going to get worse for these privateers. When they got back to Nevis with their paltry winnings in hand, and when they handed off most of their sugar to the Captain General, he had orders for them. Orders? You guys take orders? Wow. Sucks to be you. They had orders to go relieve another English squadron, this one under a Captain Thomas Hornhill. His fleet had attacked St. Martin, only upon going ashore, a French fleet under the governor of Saint-Domingue, Jean-Baptiste Ducasse, arrived surprisingly on the scene. The English who had made landfall were trapped there. They were besieged on foreign soil by, if we're being honest here, a bunch of filthy French pirates. So Admiral Houston, backed up by Captain Kidd, led the relief mission. They sailed in and opened fire on the French. It turned into an hours-long ship-of-the-line style battle. We're talking two groups of vessels firing at each other over and over and over again. It was mostly inconclusive, but really their job was to draw the attention of the French long enough that their English comrades could make their escape. It was, relative to its size at least, a pitched naval battle. Men were killed, men were injured. However, this, all in all, turned out to be a fantastic victory for the English. They really, sacked the French in the jaw here at St. Martin. Admiral Houston, and I'm calling him Admiral because he was at the head of a fleet, but really his official title was Captain Houston. But Captain Houston was a respectable officer, and in his official report after the battle, he praised Captain Kidd. Kidd had turned out to be a stout, vigorous, and talented naval commander, exactly the kind of man that England needed in this fight. It was here that Houston called Captain William Kidd, quote, a mighty man. That's high praise, but it's praise that Captain Kidd's crew did not exactly agree with. Oh, he was a fine battle commander, sure, but they weren't here to fight battles, remember? They were here to earn a little money. You're not exactly going to get rich on 3 1/3 pounds. You don't earn any money fighting off French blockades and ship-of-the-line battles. This was not what they were here to do. Men died in that fight, and did anybody on board Blessed William have anything to show for it? Aside from 3 1/3 pounds, of course. Well, there is William Kidd. He had a lot to show for it. William Kidd was the toast of the town. He was taken ashore before Codrington. He was showered in praise and granted a rank in the Regional Royal Navy for his service. It was quite the affair, quite the to-do in praise of Captain Kidd. But while he was ashore, we can assume, waltzing with Codrington's daughter and drinking champagne, the crew of the Blessed William, who had once again been left to guard the ship, they came to a decision. Those respectable privateers just took the ship. They elected William Mason as their captain, with Robert Culliford quartermaster, and then they sailed Blessed William off into the night. They had decided at last to be pirates. And this more or less catches William Kidd up to the establishment of St. Mary's off the coast of Madagascar. That's going to kind of be our focal point over the next few weeks, get everybody caught up to that moment. However, William Kidd's story kind of pauses here. While Mason and Culliford and George Rayner and John Ireland and Thomas Tew and Henry Every, while they're all really about to get going, Captain Kidd is going to sail for New York. He's going to marry well, in fact. He's going to settle down into a life of wealthy domestic bliss for a while. That's where we're going to leave him, and we'll talk more about that domestic bliss when we return to the story of Captain Kidd. But in the meantime, next time, we're going to go back across the Atlantic Ocean. We're going to visit our good friend, a gunner's mate, serving in the 9 Years' War, currently about to engage in disastrous battle. Long Ben Bridgman. Or, Henry Every. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank everybody who has helped to support the show, everybody who has signed up to become a patron on Patreon, everybody who has left us ratings or reviews, and everybody who has recommended this show to your friends or family. You all make this possible. And a quick note, one of you recently got in touch with me to let me know that the Pirate History Podcast is currently sitting at number 17 on the Society and Culture podcast list in Argentina. There were others in there too, lower down, but not significantly, all across the Spanish-speaking Americas, which is, well, that's awesome. I'll be sure to buy and then raise a glass of Argentinian wine, or maybe a mug of yerba mate. Either way, thanks for all the support. All of you, I mean it. Our theme music was, as always, The Old Captain by the fantastic band Brillig. If you haven't checked them out yet, you absolutely should do so. You can find them at brillig.com.au. That's brillig.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com. As always, and most importantly, thank you for listening. Today's episode was going to be a Henry Every episode, a pure Henry Every episode. But as I delved into the first act of this Henry Every episode, I realized that its significance was much more significant than I had anticipated. So today's episode will be less of a Henry Every episode and more an episode about the political and mostly military forces at play in England in the summer of 1690. More, it's a story about the first major defeat suffered by England in the 9 Years' War. This is episode 190, The Battle of Beachy Head. If we're talking about the highest echelons of English politics, there's nowhere to begin but with the King and Queen. I find that I'm often guilty of overlooking Queen Mary II. William and Mary were, after all, co-monarchs with equal power. There are a few reasons for that, I think. Partly it's by design, by the design of the royal family. Queen Mary always purposefully took a back seat to her husband. But in part, of course, it's the war. William III was the commander-in-chief of the forces of England, after all. When it comes to pirates and privateers, he was the supreme military commander, responsible for all of that. William's name appears on the commissions of privateers like William Kidd and Thomas Tew. Ultimately, William III was Henry Every's boss. But I think also it has to do with the Parliament. When William and Mary ascended the throne, their royal powers were significantly curtailed. They're considered, and really are, the first constitutional monarchs in England. And for that alone, if not a number of other things, I think Queen Mary deserves a fair bit of credit. If one has to have a monarch, and, I don't know that they do, but if you do have a monarch, Queen Mary was really setting the tone, the template for what that should look like. Rather than ruling, Queen Mary proved herself to be an effective administrator. The Privy Council, which was really her Privy Council, William had his own Council of War, but the Privy Council were doing the job, the day-to-day work of running the government. But it was Mary who oversaw those ministers. And if you're going to have a monarch as a chief executive, that's what I want out of my chief executive. When it came to her active day-to-day duties, Mary spent most of her time overseeing the church, the reforming and reorganizing and safeguarding of the Anglican Church. But with all of that said, it's really not Queen Mary or William with which we're concerned today. Instead, we're going to be talking about a lot of military officers, naval officers in particular, and I'm going to throw a bunch of names at you. But honestly, with a couple of exceptions, you don't really need to remember any of them, aside from, of course, Henry Every. He's here today during this whole story. Now, aside from doing his job on board his ship, he's not really a key player, but I want you to keep him in mind. As a Royal Navy sailor who's going to go on to become one of the most famous pirates of all time, the story today is going to shape Henry Every. It's going to mold who he becomes. Now, this story takes place during the Williamite War in Ireland, as does so much of the early war at sea. The Battle of Beachy Head is a direct result of the Williamite War, but it's not really a part of it. You'll recall, though, that James Stuart, the deposed King James II, gathered his forces in France. One of his top lieutenants, Earl Tyrconnell, built up Jacobite forces in Ireland. James landed his initial invasion force in Ireland with 2,600 French and English soldiers. It was a small force, but in conjunction with the Jacobite forces raised by Tyrconnell, James led a well-run campaign against the Irish Protestants loyal to King William. That campaign went well for about a month until King William sailed his own forces over to Ireland to counter it. And that is where the naval trouble began. See, King James had almost no navy. There were a few officers who had taken their ships after the Revolution, but for the most part, King James relied on Louis XIV and the French Navy for all of his sea power. That brings us to the Battle of Bantry Bay. That's the battle in which King Louis engaged a fleet to ferry over troops and supplies to support James in Ireland. That was Henry Every's first documented naval battle of any real consequence. Every sailed under Captain Francis Wheeler, and Wheeler sailed under Admiral Arthur Herbert. Herbert was a luminary of the Royal Navy. Remember, he was the commander who came up with the phrase and the concept, a fleet in being. He's going to be a key player today. But of course, the English lost that battle. The French, under their admiral, the Marquis de Chateau-Renaud, sailed out of the port at Brest to deliver those supplies to Ireland. They were successful in that. But the French were battered at the Battle of Bantry Bay, and they returned to the port at Brest in disarray. While they repaired and refitted their ships, Chateau-Renaud left them. He sailed off to take up another command. Now, the fleet at Brest was given to his vice-admiral, the Comte de Tourville, another key player today. But the English really weren't in much better shape than the French. Admiral Herbert pulled back to the mouth of the Thames to refit his fleet. That's where Captain Wheeler and Henry Every and nearly everybody else under Wheeler's command, that's where they transferred over to HMS Albemarle, where Every was promoted to a master's mate. But as all of this refitting and repairing was going on, everybody was keeping their eyes turned to the south. In the Mediterranean Sea, both England and France had fleets that were vying for control. An English admiral named Killigrew commanded a fleet down there that was intended to counter the Toulon fleet. The Toulon fleet was kind of like the Biscayers, maybe, or the Windward fleet, a powerful, frightening force commanded by, in this case, the Marquis de Chateau-Renaud. The Toulon fleet was a powerhouse. Now, Killigrew did a fine job countering French dominion in the Mediterranean, as well as could be expected at least. But then, one day in early 1690, the Toulon fleet just disappeared. Killigrew just couldn't find them. Problem is, he couldn't get word to England about this disappearance, not in time to do any good at least. By the time anyone had noticed this absence, the Toulon fleet under Chateau-Renaud had sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules and into the Atlantic Ocean. They were leaving the Mediterranean and heading north. Now, Killigrew engaged in this is one of those stories that I can easily imagine in the form of, a thick hardback book. The type of book read by old men with a mint julep and a pipe sitting on the porch for hours on end. This was a desperate and ultimately doomed, yet courageous naval action undertaken by Killigrew. He opened up his sails, full sail, and chased after the Toulon fleet as hard as possible. If we were telling that story, we could imagine the speech that Killigrew gave to his men about catching their mortal enemy and saving England, of the hardships and sacrifices made on this chase. But of course this isn't that story, because Killigrew, in the end, failed to catch Chateau Renaud. He came close, very near Cadiz in Spain, but the wind and the weather turned against him. Now, we know today, thanks to their ship's logs, but neither Killigrew nor Chateau Renaud knew it at the time, but we know that the two fleets were very nearly within a few leagues of each other. Killigrew almost had them. But in the disarray following a storm, the French slipped away. And it was at that point when he reassembled his fleet that Killigrew decided it was time to turn around, to sail back to the Mediterranean. As it would turn out, this was a fateful decision. But we can all understand the instinct, I think. Killigrew had abandoned his post in the Mediterranean. They were far from their assigned location, and the admiral was operating on his own authority. He didn't have orders here. He might just get in trouble for chasing Chateau Renaud down into the Atlantic. But of course the opposite turned out to be true. In part because of this decision to turn around and head back, giving Chateau Renaud free rein over the Atlantic, Killigrew would, later on, fall under suspicion. It's something that we're going to begin to see more and more of in William and Mary's England. If a commander, or a lord, or an MP even, or almost anyone in their kingdom failed them, the possibility that that failure would be accused of Jacobite sympathies could get really serious. Killigrew was going to be accused of those sympathies. He was going to be demoted from his field command to what amounted to a paper-pushing desk job at the Admiralty. And later on, we'll see major figures in the English government, men like John Churchill, that are going to fall under the same dark cloud. Which is, that's crazy. Churchill wasn't a Jacobite, not by any stretch of the imagination. But he was a man who had the connections, through his wife, mostly, but he had the connections and the guts to tell William and Mary things that they did not want to hear. Therefore, he would fall under suspicion. It's handy to have a religious and social boogeyman to pin on all of your enemies. Oh, this guy disagrees with us? Well, he must be some kind of crypto-Catholic Jacobite loyalist, right? But if Killigrew had not turned back here, if he had not decided to return back to the Mediterranean, if he'd kept up the chase, he could have miraculously, at the 11th hour, at the perfect moment, turned up behind the French fleet at perhaps the most critical moment in the battle to come. He could have saved the day for England. That hypothetical moment, had that been the case, that would make Killigrew's voyage worthy of the thickest of old novels read by old men on the porch, the longest of old movies watched by old men on Thanksgiving afternoon. But that's not the story we have. Instead, at this point, there are essentially 4 fleets in play. The Toulon fleet under Admiral Chateau Renaud was in the Bay of Biscay between Spain and France, but they were headed for the Channel. Another French fleet under the Comte de Tourville was still lingering at Brest. Then there's that Dutch fleet I mentioned, They were busy guarding the channel, and we should note their admiral. Cornelis Evertsen is a name that you may remember. The elder Cornelis Evertsen was involved in some of the absolutely stunning Dutch privateer raids in the 1630s and 1640s. His son, Cornelis Evertsen the Younger, was a major player in the West Indies during the buccaneering era. We ran into him while talking about Henry Morgan more than a few times. But this Cornelis Evertsen the Youngest, was admiral of the Dutch Channel Fleet here in the summer of 1690. And then there's the English Channel Fleet, still at anchor at the mouth of the Thames under Arthur Herbert, the Earl of Torrington. But there, at the mouth of the Thames and in London, is where the drama is to be found. Arthur Herbert was the captain that carried the invitation to William, the invitation to invade England, just a couple of years ago, back in 1688. Herbert was an early and passionate Williamite who was raised to the peerage, made the Earl Torrington by William himself. Immediately after William and Mary's accession, he was briefly the Lord High Admiral. It was a temporary posting, kind of an acting Lord High Admiral, but that's the sort of trust that King William put in Arthur Herbert. By this point in his career, he was First Lord of the Admiralty. Herbert's assessment of the naval situation was counter to that of some of the more powerful lords in London. There were three men in particular who disagreed with Herbert's assessment of the situation. Thomas Osborne, Duke of Leeds, Marquis of Carmarthen, was president of the Royal Council. He was perhaps the top figure in English politics after the King and Queen. Now, we're not going to dwell on his resume. We'll have a lot more to say about Osborne in days to come, but his voice in this matter, as in all matters, carried a lot of weight. More, though, we have the Earl of Nottingham. Nottingham was a rich and powerful politician. He was the kind of guy who grew up in a palace, who went to Oxford. At 32, he entered the Parliament, and at no point in those 32 years before entering politics did he serve in any active military role. But in 1682, when his father died, when he was raised to the earldom, he was made First Lord of the Admiralty. He would serve later as naval treasurer. Nottingham, though, was a politician. That's what his role was. That's what his job was. But for him, that meant that his own gain would always come first, even before that of the country. Those are the two names, in addition to Henry Every, you will need to remember, Leeds and Nottingham. Not a lot, they're not going to be on the test, but those two are going to continue to be major political players all the way through Queen Anne's War. Their decisions, especially those of Osborne, are going to impact the pirates in Nassau in major ways. But then we have a third name, Edward Russell, Earl of Orford. The one thing I'll say for Russell here is that he, at least, unlike the others, had at some point in his life commanded ships. He'd been captain of half a dozen or more third and fourth-rate ships of the line. Thanks to his disloyal tendencies, he'd been fired by James II and raised back to admiral when William III took the throne. For a time, shortly after the Glorious Revolution, when Arthur Herbert had served as acting Lord High Admiral, he had served as acting Admiral of the Channel Fleet. But after all the reshuffling was done, when Arthur Herbert fell into his role of First Lord of the Admiralty, Orford was effectively demoted to just a Lord of the Admiralty, a position that found itself stuck on land in London, directly under the supervision of Admiral Arthur Herbert. Effectively, Orford was kicked down a rung on the ladder by Arthur Herbert. Those three men, though, Leeds, Nottingham, and Orford, were all at court. They were all men who had Queen Mary's ear. and they formed a united front. They were all of the opinion that the French were weak in their fleet at Brest. It was battered and bedraggled. It was tiny and ineffectual. If Admiral Herbert were any kind of commander at all, he would sail out immediately and crush them, because that's what Englishmen do. Now we should remember that Arthur Herbert actually fought this force at the Battle of Bantry Bay. He argued that the French fleet was much stronger than any of these three men said. He argued that they were waiting in the port at Brest not because they were unable to fight, but because they didn't need to. He argued that the French fleet was a fleet in being. Their presence was such that the onus was on the English to take back control from them. And if they were to strike, Arthur Herbert argued, they needed to do so when the time was right, and right now the time was most certainly not right. But Leeds and Nottingham and Orford called him a coward. They called him a weakling. I mean, after all, it's not like the French have the Marquis de Chateau Renaud with them or anything. He was in the Mediterranean, so what are you waiting for? All three men were known to insinuate at court, so we can assume that they were much more direct in private, but they insinuated that Herbert was no better than a traitor. His reluctance, his unwillingness to fight for England, showed him to be probably a closet Jacobite, filthy, treasonous scum. Keep in mind, they were saying this about the man who had carried the invitation to William. Osborne had argued loudly, vociferously against William coming to England, but here he was, calling the man who invited William to come into England a traitor. The man who had, on peril of his own head, helped to aid William in taking the throne. None of what those men were saying about him was true, but those three nobles were playing politics, the worst kind of politics. They were pushing Queen Mary and Admiral Herbert into waters that were dangerous, not just for themselves, but to the very realm itself. They were pushing England into dangerous waters purely for their own personal and professional gain. Is it despicable? Absolutely. Was it effective? Oh, you know it was. The Queen was beginning to listen to these snakes in the grass. Mary gave these lords permission to draft orders for Arthur Herbert, Earl of Torrington. Those orders, signed by Orford and countersigned by Nottingham, on authority of the Crown, remember, those ordered Admiral Herbert to sail out and fight the French. And Herbert really didn't want to go. He called a council of his commanders to discuss what they should do, but the orders were clear. It was agreed that any hesitation or reluctance on his part would be seen as treason. Might even see him, tossed into the Tower of London or put on trial. So Admiral Herbert ordered that their sails be unfurled, that the flags be raised, and that the fleet advance into the Channel. The combined English forces had 3 squadrons. The vanguard out front was the Dutch squad, led by Cornelis Evertsen. The center squadron, the largest of the English forces, was going to be commanded by Admiral Herbert personally. That's where HMS Albemarle and Henry Every were stationed. And then bringing up the rear was a North Sea unit commanded by Vice Admiral Delaval. That fleet, on Crown orders, sailed southwest down the Channel, about halfway from London to the Isle of Wight. The fleet moved cautiously. Herbert really didn't want to be here, and they wanted to avoid any unnecessary surprises, but they were going to be surprised regardless. Beachy Head is a location that most of you have seen. If you watch movies, anything from James Bond to Harry Potter to almost any war film about the Battle of Britain, you've seen Beachy Head or something very like it. Those towering white cliffs overlooking the English Channel, the cliff face that runs along so much of England's southern coast. Those white cliffs are the setting for a battle that was about to turn the air black with smoke and to turn the sea red with blood. The French were coming up from the southwest, heading northeast, in 3 matching squadrons. Now, that's not the surprise. Naval formations in this kind of battle of the line were almost always split into this 3-squad formation. The surprise when the English encountered the French fleet was the size of the French force. Chateau Renaud and the entire Toulouse squadron wasn't supposed to be there. They were supposed to be in the Mediterranean. And yet here he was, Chateau Renaud and his entire squadron in the van. They were to counter the Dutch fleet under Evertsen. Now the center of the French fleet was led by Admiral Tourville, and the rear was commanded by yet another son of a famous West Indies commander, Victor Marie d'Estrées. So you've got 3 squadrons on each side, a powerful van, a large center, and a slightly less powerful rear guard. The 2 fleets spotted each other around 8 a.m. on 10th July 1690, just off the coast of Beachy Head, in full view of those towering white cliffs. Thanks to the surprise arrival of the Marquis de Chateau Renaud, the French fleet was comprised of 75 ships of the line, with 23 fire ships to back them up. The combined English and Dutch fleet had only 56 ships of the line. The vanguards under Chateau Renaud and Evertsen tacked to the north to face off. d'Estrées and de Laval, in their respective rears, pulled to the south, while Admirals Tourville and Herbert made up the center bodies. From the very outset of the battle, even before a shot was fired, everybody knew how terribly mismatched this contest was. Evertsen's fleet, Evertsen was the youngest son of a famous admiral who was arguably there thanks to nepotism. And he was facing off against the most famous admiral in the French Navy, an admiral who at this point had almost double the ships in his squad. This wasn't going to go well for Evertsen, and the fighting almost immediately devolved as soon as shots began to be fired into a fierce, bloody fight. Ships were being lost within the hour, and all of them were on the side of the Dutch under Evertsen. From moment one, from 8:30 in the morning, it was a desperate bid to survive. Now, Admirals Herbert and Tourville were relatively evenly matched in the center. They could have stood there and fired it out all day long, but they never came into contact with one another. Tourville, rather than advance and attack, let his squad drift with the wind, which was blowing to the southwest. He was drifting backwards from the line of battle. It wasn't a retreat, but it created a dip in the French line, a semicircle, a crescent, into which Admiral Herbert allowed himself to be drawn. He was trying to engage with the enemy, but still he never came into range with the French. Now, the battle to the south, the rear guard action between de Laval and d'Estrées, they were more evenly matched than the north. The battle held up for a couple of hours of near-constant bombardment, but as time went on, the battle began to turn more and more in the French favor. English losses began to stack up to the north and to the south. All the while, Admiral Herbert was just unable to even engage with the enemy. That left Admiral Herbert with 3 options. He could continue this course of action. He could continue to chase Tourville down the center, all while his fleet was blown to the bottom of the channel. Or he could choose to aid either de Laval or Evertsen. Or, third, he could split up his forces and attempt to bolster both of them. Now, as an experienced age-of-sail naval commander myself, let me tell you what I think Herbert should have done here. Aside from, honestly, he should have just surrendered immediately, but if he wanted to have any chance of winning this battle, I think Admiral Herbert should have sacrificed the Southern squad, abandoned de Laval, and joined forces with Evertson in the north. If things had gone their way, which wasn't likely, but at least possible, but he may have been able to crush Chateau Renaud alongside Evertson before Tourville arrived with his center force. If they could have forced Chateau Renaud to withdraw, then Evertson and Herbert together could have turned their forces on Tourville. They would have had to fight Tourville immediately after, and everyone would have been exhausted, but it would have given them a chance. Instead of that, though, Admiral Herbert decided to split his center force, his large main body, into 3 smaller squadrons. He was going to try to support both Evertson and de Laval while holding the center. Herbert was trying to achieve everything, and yet he would achieve nothing. The squadron he sent north to bolster Evertson, led by Vice Admiral John Ashby, failed to line up with their Dutch allies. Instead of joining the line and opening fire, as he should have done, thanks mostly to the rough Channel winds, Vice Admiral Ashby drifted right into the line of fire between the 2 opposing forces. Now, this was a mistake, not a tactical mistake. This was an accident. He didn't mean to do this. And his blunder did manage to soak up some of the French fire for a while, which sounds great, but really didn't help. Rather than bolster the line of Cornelis Evertson, all Ashby did was force Evertson to open up sail and move around this English squadron that had just arrived on the scene. They had to get a line of fire on the French, which took time. It takes so much time, in fact, that by the time Evertson had made it all the way around this English squadron to reform the line, Ashby had taken a pounding. He had to pull back from the line that he had inadvertently created. That means that once again Evertson, who had had no break, no opportunity to turn the tide, had to resume a losing battle. So, thanks for absolutely nothing, John Ashby. When Vice Admiral Ashby pulled back, Evertson, who was just getting into place, decided to retreat himself. He just kept on sailing. Thanks to the ineptitude of Admiral John Ashby, the Dutch and this English northern squadron pulled out of the fighting. The northern flank had been lost in the battle, thanks to one disastrous mistake. Now, to the south, the squad that had been sent to bolster de Laval did a much better job. They almost turned the tide against the southern French squadron under d'Estrées, but when that north squadron fell, when that flank fell, Chateau Renaud was free to pull all of his forces to the northeast and to flank the rest of the center under Admiral Herbert. The English center now faced Chateau Renaud to the north and Admiral Tourville to the southwest. They were effectively surrounded. Henry Every's HMS Albemarle was surrounded. Now, this gave the French Admiral Tourville plenty of leeway. He took advantage of the situation and split his own center squadron. Half of his French center peeled off to similarly flank Admiral de Laval in the south. By about 4 p.m., on July the 10th, both the English center and the English south were outflanked. They were surrounded and outgunned by a significant margin. Admiral Arthur Herbert, Earl of Torrington, gave the order to retreat. It was a disastrous loss for England. Now, had Tourville pursued the English, he could have crushed them completely. I'm talking about demolishing the entire English and most of the Dutch naval presence in the Channel. That would have been a coup. That would have meant that the 9 Years' War could have become the 1 Year War. It would have been a quick and decisive French victory that, rather than being a major chapter in history textbooks, would be a footnote. But of course those textbooks would be written in French. But Admiral Tourville did not pursue the English. Instead, he pulled back to lick his own wounds, which it was a mistake on his part. He would be reprimanded by the Crown, but it's not going to affect his career. Within a couple of years, Admiral Tourville was going to earn a marshal's baton. This was a smashing victory over England, and everybody knew it. Admiral Herbert knew it, as did everybody at court in London. When he returned to England, Admiral Herbert was arrested. He was thrown in the Tower of London and brought up on charges. All of this on the expert legal counsel of a bunch of men who had a lot to gain from Herbert's downfall, the very same cabal of snakes that pushed Admiral Herbert into a fight he did not think he could win in the first place. Leeds and Orford and Nottingham, they were behind it all. They all brought charges and they all testified against Admiral Herbert. It's from his trial that we get open claims that Herbert was a Jacobite. The arguments that Admiral Herbert was an alcoholic who, rather than spend his days leading his sailors, was known to bring 2 or 3 working women on board his craft to while away his days rather than do his job. Now, none of that's true. At least when evidence was presented, Admiral Herbert was acquitted on all charges. But his career, well, it was in shambles. Admiral Herbert would retire from public life and effectively off the pages of history. The Earl of Orford, a lord of the Admiralty who had been demoted, kicked down a rung on the ladder, remember? Well, he walked back up. He was made First Lord of the Admiralty once again under the Lord High Admiral. All of this really seems to have worked out for the lords there in England who had conspired against Herbert. But while those 3 men benefited greatly, the price for England was high. Their naval strength took a serious hit at Beachy Head. There were huge losses in manpower and in guns and ships, losses that would take years to properly replace. But the biggest loss, the most immediate, was a loss in morale. The English Navy was not used to losses like this. The English people weren't used to losses like this. It came as a shock to every sailor in the Royal Navy, both those who were there at Beachy Head and those who weren't. It shook the people of England and of the colonies. And perhaps most importantly to our story, it came as a shock to all of those private naval contractors on which England so very much relied. Only a few weeks after the Battle of Beachy Head had been brought to its disastrous conclusion, the master's mate of HMS Albemarle, Henry Every, resigned his post in the Royal Navy. He left the Navy. And he wasn't alone. A bunch of his shipmates did so as well, as did men from all over the Navy. All across the world, privateers, men like Thomas Tew, began to question if sailing for England was still a good idea. At Beachy Head, England had very nearly lost the war, the entire war, and everybody knew it. If Tourville had pursued the English, they would have been out of a job. A lot of those privateers, dozens of them, hundreds of them, all in all, it would turn out to be thousands of them, decided that sailing for England was no longer a good idea. Instead, those Royal Navy men and those privateers decided it would be better to sail for themselves. Nearly all of them eventually sailing to Madagascar. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank everybody who has helped to support the show, everybody who has signed up to become a patron on Patreon, everybody who has left us ratings or reviews, and everybody who has recommended this show to your friends or family. You all make this possible. Thanks for all the support. All of you, I mean it. Our theme music was, as always, The Old Captain by the fantastic band Brillig. If you haven't checked them out yet, you absolutely should do so. You can find them at brillig.com.au. That's brillig.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com. As always, and most importantly, thank you for listening.